Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Timothy. Today we're continuing to look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, where Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet, for Adam was formed first, and then Eve. Now in yesterday's session we said there's more ambiguity to this passage than is sometimes assumed, because in other letters of Paul, we see clear evidence that he allowed for women in the church to have places of authority and positions of influence and positions of teaching. We look carefully, you remember, at Romans chapter 16 and the examples of women in leadership in the church. So we suggested that perhaps there's something in Ephesus where Timothy was at when this letter was written to him. Maybe there was some particular context in Ephesus that caused this particular verse to be said. And there was. Now, you might remember that when Paul first evangelized Ephesus, we read about that in Acts chapter 19, at the end of a few years of ministry and establishing the church there was a great riot on the instigation of some silversmiths in the city. These silversmiths, led by a man named Demetrius, started a riot against Paul and the Christian church because their business was being affected. They made little images of the goddess Artemis, who was worshipped in Ephesus. And that business was being affected by Paul's preaching the spread of the church. But what I want to focus on is the Artemis of the Ephesians, the goddess that they were making these little idol figures of. Now in Acts chapter 19, around verses 23 and following, it tells how Demetrius called other workers of the silversmiths together and said, we've got to do something about this guy Paul and this spread of Christianity. It's affecting our business. We're losing our business. And then he says in verse 27 of chapter 19, there is danger, says Demetrius, not only that our trade will lose its good name, in other words, they're losing business, but that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and that the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. Now when they heard this, they all were furious, and they began to shout, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Soon the whole city was in an uproar. So this matter of the worship of Artemis and her temple was used to cause a riot against Paul and the Christian church. Now, Artemis was a goddess, a pagan goddess worshipped in the city of Ephesus. And there was a great temple in Ephesus that was dedicated to her worship. As a matter of fact, the most imposing part of the city of Ephesus was the great temple of Artemis. It was said to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a tremendous structure and housed a tremendous apparatus to worship Artemis. Artemis is also called Diana. That's what the Romans called her. Now notice, this is a female goddess, a female deity, and worship of this female deity dominates the city of Ephesus. In the ancient times, that was the most notable thing about Ephesus, was they worshipped Artemis and had this great temple. Since it was a female goddess and a female deity, it was dominated by women. They had the leadership in the temple and in promoting the worship of their particular goddess. Now, maybe that as the Christian church began to grow, there was some negative influence from this domination of Artemis upon members of the church. And it may have been that some who came out of that worship of Artemis or Diana, even though they had been converted from it, yet they still had all their training in it. And in the temple of Artemis, the leadership was all female. And so it may be Paul was saying that even though women lead in the worship of Artemis, they don't have to lead here. Now, women, I think, probably did have leadership in the Ephesian church that Timothy was leading, but maybe some of them thought that women should have all the leadership. And so what Paul is saying is that the women can lead in the worship of Jesus Christ and in the Christian church. They don't have to. Now, they have to in the worship of Artemis. they must lead in the worship of Diana. But in the Christian church, they can, but they don't have to. It is perfectly permissible for a woman to take a position of submission and quietness. She does not have to lead. Where in the worship of Artemis, women pretty much had to lead. In the worship in the Christian church, they could, but they didn't have to. So it may be that this verse is not necessarily a prohibition against women leadership. It is simply saying that in the Christian church, they don't have to lead. They can, but they don't have to. Both men and women are equal, and they both can lead in the life of the church. That is a very real possibility, and that will help us understand why this verse is in Timothy, but not in some of the other passages. We'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. I've got a little bit more I want to say on this passage. So I hope you'll join us for our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Timothy.